Back in 2016, football and the world looked very different. There was no COVID pandemic. There was no ChatGPT. VAR still hadn't taken over football. And most importantly, Arsenal still hadn't won the league, so all was right with the world. But as we now approach the 10-year anniversary of one of the most shocking moments in international football, it feels like the perfect time to look back at Portugal's incredible Euro 2016 win. Portugal went to France as outsiders. They weren't one of the favourites. They weren't the most exciting team. On paper, despite having one of, if not the best depending on what side of the argument you fall under, player in the world, their squad was just average, if not an ageing squad. And for large parts of that tournament, they didn't even look like they'd make it out of the groups. And in the end, it was the most unlikely squad imaginable, who were able to give Portugal their first ever major international trophy. But this story is more than just one moment, one strike, one player, because every player in that squad had a role. Every individual added something. And this wasn't just a story of one moment, of one goal, of one player. It was a story, a survival, sacrifice, belief, and a team that refused to lose. But before we get into Portugal's Euro 2016 campaign, we need to remember what football looked like back in 2016. In England, the impossible had happened. Leicester City, managed by Claudio Ranieri, won the Premier League despite starting the season as 5,000-1 outsiders. It remains one of the most greatest underdog stories in football and sports ever, and also we're in the betting market for the foreseeable, if not forever. In Spain, Barcelona won La Liga for the 24th time. In France, Germany and Italy, things were a little bit more predictable, with Paris Saint-Germain, Bayern Munich and Juventus all winning their leagues, as they so often did during that era. In the Champions League, it was an all-Madrid final. Real Madrid faced Atletico Madrid, and after a 1-1 draw in 90 minutes, Real Madrid won on penalties to lift their 11th European Cup. And over in Portugal, Sporting fans were left wondering what might have been. Benfica won the league by just 2 points, while one of the most painful images of the season was Brian Ruiz missing an open goal in the Lisbon derby, a moment Sporting supporters still haven't fully recovered from, nor will Benfica fans let them recover from. Away from football, let's look at the music charts. Drake's One Dance was everywhere, becoming the UK's best-selling single of that year and spending 15 straight weeks at #1. And at the cinema, it was a huge year for Disney. Captain America Civil War finished as the highest grossing film worldwide, followed by Rogue One, A Star Wars Story, and Finding Dory. So that was the world Portugal were in at that moment. In a world of less than miracles, Madrid dominance, Drake on repeat and Portuguese heartbreak for Sporting at club level. But by the end of that summer, Portugal would create a miracle of their own. But as I always do on this channel, let's talk about Liga Portugal. Because Portugal's Euro 2016 squad wasn't just built around Cristiano Ronaldo, it had a real Liga Portugal spine, and Sporting in particular became a huge part of that story. Under Bruno de Carvalho, Sporting had undergone a rebuild. The club had recentered itself around a strong Portuguese core, and by 2016, a number of those players weren't just important at club level, they were becoming important for the national team as well. From Sporting alone, in that Portugal Euro 2016 squad, you had Rui Patricio, João Mario, William Carvalho and Adrian Silva. But in total, 10 members of the squad had either started or come through Sporting's academy. But it wasn't just Sporting. There was Eliseu from Benfica, Rafa Silva from Braga, Danilo Pereira from Porto, and there was Renato Sanchez, the 18-year-old Benfica prodigy who exploded onto the scene and forced his way into the squad before most players his age had even established themselves at club level. And before the tournament, he had completed a mega money move to Bayern Munich. But in Portugal's team, there was also experience, as well as the youth. There was a very strong domestic core, of course, but there were also players who had built their careers abroad in very different ways. There was even a bit of a Turkish-based contingent. Bruno Alves and Nani were both at Fenerbahce, while Ricardo Quaresma was at Besiktas. Three players with very different careers, but all still capable of giving Portugal something on the big stage, whether that was leadership, unpredictability, or in Quaresma's case, and Nani's to be fair, pure magic. But what makes this squad so interesting is that not everyone followed that perfect through. The biggest case study of this is Jose Fonte. Because Fonte was born in Portugal, but that's not what he made his name. He spent time with Sporting's B team, then moved through the ranks of Felgueiras, Vitória de Setúbal, Benfica, Paços de Ferreira, Estrela da Amadora, but in Portugal, it just never quite became the career that people might have expected. So instead, Jose Fonte forged a different path. One in England. First with Crystal Palace, and then in 2010, he made the move that probably looked like a backward step at the time. He joined Southampton all the way down in League One. But that decision changed everything in Jose Fonte's career. Fonte went from the third tier of English football all the way to the Premier League with the same club. He became Southampton captain, he played over 280 games for the Saints, and by the time Euro 2016 came around, he wasn't just some late bloomer making up the numbers. He was really one of Portugal's most reliable defenders, alongside Pepe, who of course doesn't need this background. He is a multiple time Champions League winner and a legend of Portugal, and arguably maybe of the sport as well. The craziest part of Jose Fonte's story is that he only made his Portugal debut at the age of 30. In a squad full of big names, Fonte's story was different, especially compared to someone like Ricardo Carvalho. Now everyone knows Ricardo Carvalho, and for me, he is probably one of the most underrated centre backs in history. But in 2016, it looked like his international career might have been over. You see, back in 2012, Ricardo Carvalho actually walked out of the Portugal camp before a Euro 2012 qualifier against Cyprus. He later announced his retirement from international football, saying he felt disrespected by then manager Paulo Bento. And for more than 3 years, that looked like the end for Ricardo Carvalho. But then in 2013, the centre-back was then brought back into the Portugal setup. And by the time Euro 2016 came around, Carvalho was 38 years old. He was playing for Monaco, his peak years were obviously at Porto, Chelsea and Real Madrid, and they, to be honest, were long behind him. And yet there he was, back in the squad, adding experience, calmness and authority to a team that badly needed it. Then, a different story compared to those two is Rafael Guerreiro. You see, his story was so different because he was actually born in France, and he never actually started his career in Portugal. He came through Cannes, then moved to Lorient in 2013, and to a lot of casual fans, and to be fair, myself at the time, he was a relatively unknown name going into that tournament. He had represented Portugal at under 21 level, but even when he first entered the senior setup, there was one slightly small awkward detail. He actually didn't speak Portuguese. But talent is talent, and Guerreiro at the time gave Portugal something they desperately needed, which was balance on the left hand side and energy going forward, and to be honest, a modern day fullback profile that made him into one of the more quietly important players in this team. Then there was João Moutinho. By 2016, Moutinho was 29 and had already done a lot in the game. He had come through at Sporting, being one of their youngest captains of all time. He won league titles and the Europa League with Porto, and then he moved to Monaco and became a key player there too. For Portugal, he was already one of the most established and experienced heads in midfield, but he also had a lot of unfinished business. At Euro 2012, Portugal had pushed Spain all the way to penalties in the semi-final. Moutinho stepped out in the shootout and missed. Portugal went out. So 4 years later, he wasn't just chasing a trophy, he was chasing a whole different ending. But then, of course, finally, we have to talk about Cristiano Ronaldo. He is some people's GOAT, and especially for Portuguese people, a lot of them anyway, the player who carried the hopes of an entire country for more than a decade. I do agree that maybe it's unfair to say Cristiano put Portugal on the map, but he definitely carried Portugal through some tough times and arguably to tournaments just through himself. And in 2016, Cristiano Ronaldo was still massively in his prime. He had just won another Champions League with Real Madrid, finishing as the competition's top scorer, and his goal scoring record for Portugal was already ridiculous. But there was still one thing missing. The one thing that haunted Ronaldo, and Messi up until this point, a major international trophy. He had been there in 2004 when Portugal lost the Euros final at home to Greece. He had been there in 2006 when Portugal reached a World Cup semi-final. He had been there through the disappointments of 2008, 2010, 2012 and 2014. and Portugal never got over the line. And people may say, well, look at the teams Ronaldo had around him. And to an extent I do get that, but on paper this 2016 team was not obviously stronger than Portugal teams of 2006, 2008, 2010, 12 or 14. And it definitely wasn't as strong as the team from Euro 2004. So the idea that Portugal went into Euro 2016 favourites just isn't really true. This was no super team. It was a strange mix. Of course you've got the superstar, but then you have the veterans, the late bloomers and the young players. And that domestic core shaped heavily by Liga Portugal. But not only were some of the players new, there was also a new man on the block. Which is strange considering that by 2016, Fernando Santos was 61 years old. But for Portugal, he was the new man in charge. And to be honest, outside of Portugal and Greece, a lot of people probably didn't really know who he was. Now Fernando Santos wasn't a glamorous appointment, he wasn't a superstar manager, he wasn't someone who had a lot of stock across Europe. But he did have experience, and a lot of it. He started his managerial career at Estoril before moving to Estrela da Amadora. Then in 1988 he got his big break with Porto, and at Porto he did very well. Between 1998 and 2001, Fernando Santos managed Porto for 3 seasons, winning the league, domestic cups and building a reputation as a serious, organised and practical coach. But after Porto, his career became a bit of a tour around Portugal and Greece. He went to AEK Athens, Panathinaikos, before returning to Portugal with Sporting, and then it was back to AEK Athens, then Benfica, then PAOK. And finally, in 2010, he became manager of the Greek national team. And this is where Fernando Santos really started to make his name internationally. Because with Greece, he genuinely did some impressive work. At Euro 2012, Greece were drawn in a group with Poland, Russia and the Czech Republic. Now don't get me wrong, it's not the toughest group in the world, but it was awkward and competitive, and Greece weren't really expected to do much. But under Fernando Santos, they did find a way. They finished second in the group, 4 points, 1 win, 1 draw and 1 defeat. And they reached the quarterfinals, where they ran into Germany, who unfortunately were just too strong, winning 4-2. But for Greece, getting out of the group and reaching the last 8 was still seen as a success. Then came the 2014 World Cup in Brazil. Once again, Greece were put into a difficult group, this time with Colombia, Ivory Coast and Japan. And once again, Santos found a way through. Greece finished second in the group with 4 points, beating Ivory Coast in dramatic fashion in their final game to reach the knockout stages of the World Cup for the first time in their history. And in the last 16, they faced Costa Rica. Now you might say, well that's a bit of a strange matchup, but Costa Rica in 2014 were on fire and they had a phenomenal World Cup. And that game did finish 1-1 after extra time, and Greece were eventually knocked out on penalties. But then, for a nation like Greece, this was fantastic work. And yes, I know Greece had won an international trophy in 2004, so they're not newcomers, let's say, but this was an entirely different generation, a new manager, and all the credit has to go to Fernando Santos. And it was under Santos that they became the exact type of team that nobody wanted to play. Greece were organised, they were disciplined, they were difficult to break down, and to be honest, they weren't always pretty to watch, but they were incredibly hard to beat. And that is why when Paulo Bento left Portugal after the disaster of the 2014 World Cup and a poor start to the Euro 2016 qualifying, Fernando Santos felt like a natural choice. He understood the culture, he had managed in the big 3 for Porto, Sporting and Benfica, he had worked in Greece with limited resources for the national team and got results, and most importantly, he knew how to build a team for a tournament. So on the 23rd of September 2014, Fernando Santos was announced as Portugal manager. And from that point on, Portugal ended up changing. Maybe not into the most exciting team, into the most beautiful team, but something they really needed to become. And that was a well-organised team that could suffer and survive, but eventually a team that could win games. Before we get to the tournament itself, we do need to speak about the Euro 2016 qualifying, because Portugal's road to France did not start smoothly. They were drawn into Group I alongside Albania, Denmark, Serbia and Armenia. And of course on paper Portugal were definitely the favourites, but this was not a nothing group. Denmark had always been awkward, Serbia always had talent, Albania were improving, and Armenia, while not one of Europe's most strongest sides, were still capable of making games uncomfortable. But still Portugal were expected to qualify, And then, in their very first game, it all went wrong. At the Estádio Municipal de Aveiro, Portugal lost 1-0 at home to Albania. No Cristiano Ronaldo goal, no ideas, no spark, just a horrible result. But for Albania it was historic, but for Portugal it was embarrassing, and for Paulo Bento it was the beginning of the end. Just a few days later, he was sacked. So Portugal had started Euro 2016 qualifying with a home defeat to Albania, a manager being sacked, and maybe a feeling that this team was stuck. Especially after 2014 crashing out in the group stages. But then Fernando Santos arrived, and from that point on Portugal changed completely. Not in a flashy way, and also not in a way that Portugal were favourites to win the Euros or even do something at that tournament. But really, Fernando Santos had a way of Portugal winning ugly. His first qualifier came on the 14th of October 2014 away to Denmark. Portugal won 1-0, but of course they didn't make it simple. The game was goalless deep into stoppage time until Cristiano Ronaldo popped up in the 95th minute to win the game for Portugal. It was a horrible game but a massive result. Then came Armenia at home on the 14th of November 2014. Again Portugal won 1-0. Again it wasn't glamorous, again it was just enough. Then on the 29th of March 2015, Portugal beat Serbia 2-1, and slowly the group began to turn. Portugal of course weren't blowing teams away, but they were doing what was necessary. They were becoming efficient, they were becoming difficult to beat, and most importantly, they were getting results, just like Greece in the last two tournaments. Then came one of Ronaldo's biggest qualifying moments. On the 13th of June 2015, Portugal went away to Armenia, and this one was chaotic. Armenia scored early and Portugal had to respond, and when they needed someone to drag them through, Ronaldo did exactly that again. He scored a hat-trick and Portugal won 3-2. And once again it was not comfortable, but once again they survived. Then, almost a year later after that humiliating home defeat to Albania, Portugal faced them again. This time away from home on the 7th of September 2015. And for most of the game it looked like another frustrating night. Portugal couldn't find a breakthrough, Albania were organised, then with the game dropping into stoppage time, Miguel Veloso, who is one of my favourite players of all time by the way, scored in the 92nd minute. 1-0 Portugal, another ugly win, another massive step towards the Euros. Then came Denmark again on the 8th of October 2015, this time in Portugal, and with the group not fully wrapped up, João Moutinho scored the winner in the 66th minute, and Portugal won 1-0, which sealed their qualification to Euro 2016. And then in the final game, with not much to play for, Portugal went away to Serbia on the 11th of October 2015, but by then the job was already done, but Portugal still finished the campaign properly. Nani and João Moutinho scored and Portugal won 2-1. And after their qualifying home loss to Albania, they'd won every single remaining games. Unbeaten under Fernando Santos, 7 games, 7 wins. But again, this tells you a lot about Fernando Santos' setup and how Portugal was still struggling to really win games. They weren't overwhelming their opponents, but they were grinding results. 1-0 away to Denmark, 1-0 to Armenia, 2-1 against Serbia, 3-2 to Armenia, 1-0 away to Albania, 1-0 against Denmark, 2-1 away to Serbia. These were tightly contested games. Again, Portugal were not favourites after this showing to go into the Euro 2016 and do something. This was pretty much survival football, and it became the identity of Portugal under Fernando Santos, just like it was for Greece. They could suffer in games, they could wait, and they could take games deep, and when the moment arrived, they just needed one moment of quality to punish you. Cristiano Ronaldo did finish as Portugal's top scorer in the qualifying with 5 goals, including the hat-trick away to Armenia. And after qualifying, Portugal finally learned their group for Euro 2016. They were placed into Group F. Portugal, Hungary, Iceland and Austria. And on paper, this was something to celebrate. This was one of the most favourable groups in the entire tournament. There was no big dogs, no Germany, no Spain, no France, no Italy, no obvious heavyweights. So naturally, people looked at Portugal and thought, they're going to win this group. But before any football could actually be played, Fernando Santos had one more massive decision to make. He had to name 23 players who would represent Portugal at Euro 2016. On the 17th of May 2016, the squad was announced. And to be honest, there weren't many major surprises. Most of the big names were there. Pepe, João Moutinho, Nani, Quaresma, Cristiano Ronaldo. But, of course, there were a few important absences. Bernardo Silva missed out through injury, which looking back now feels mad because we knew the player he would go on to become. Fabio Coentrao also missed this call-up due to injury. So did Nani, and so did Thiago, who Fernando Santos decided not to risk after his injury problems, but was very close to picking him in the midfield. So before the tournament even began, Portugal were already missing some quality. But the squad Santos picked was interesting for another reason, because this was not the same Portugal team from 2014 or 2012. In fact, there were 12 new players in this squad compared to Portugal's 2014 World Cup team. At the time, 8 players were playing their club football in Portugal, and 10 players were about to represent Portugal at a senior tournament for the first time. This tells you something quite important, that this was a Portugal squad in transition. Of course, it still had the old guard, it had Cristiano Ronaldo, Pepe, Ricardo Carvalho, Bruno Alves, Nani, Quaresma and João Moutinho, players who had been around the national team for a few years. But among them, there was something new forming, and that was the new, younger generation. And nobody represented that more than Renato Sanchez. Because at 18 years old, Renato became the youngest ever player to represent Portugal at a European Championship or World Cup. And his rise had been ridiculous. At the start of the season, he was just another young midfielder trying to break through in Benfica. And by the end of it, he had won the league, earned a move to Bayern Munich, and forced his way into Portugal's squad for the Euros whilst being one of the best midfielders in Portugal at the time. And let's be honest, if you ever watched Renato Sanchez play at that level or at that time, he was still very raw, but he was powerful, and most of all, he had confidence. And he gave something Portugal didn't have in the midfield, that chaotic energy and someone willing to drive through the middle of the pitch. And having the confidence to do that 18 years old at that level is something that even today you don't really see that often. So when you look at this squad, you might say, well, Portugal had Ronaldo. And of course, obviously they did. It was still a squad on paper that really wasn't going to amount to much. Because some players were of course at the peak of their careers, some were coming back from international setbacks, and some were getting their first chance on the proper stage. And Fernando Santos somehow had to turn that all into a winning team. A team that could of course survive tournament football, but a team that was going to suffer, and a team could find a way. And with Hungary, Iceland and Austria waiting in Group F, Portugal really had no excuses. On paper this was the perfect group. But as Portugal were about to find out, there is no such thing as perfect in international football. By the time summer of 2016 arrived, Portugal had 3 warm-up games before the Euros. First, they faced Norway on the 29th of May and won 3-0. Then came England at Wembley on the 2nd of June, which I was actually at that game, but unfortunately Portugal lost 1-0 thanks to a Chris Smalling goal and a Bruno Alves karate kick on Harry Kane in a game that was not exactly a classic. But then in their final friendly before the tournament, Portugal absolutely battered Estonia 7-0 on the 8th of June. So going into Euro 2016, it was a bit of a mixed bag. You had a comfortable win, a frustrating defeat, and then a massive confidence boosting victory. But still looking at Portugal's group, they should have been fine. Their first game in the Euro 2016 came up on the 14th of June against Iceland. And at the time, Iceland weren't yet known for the solid football they would become famous for, or of course, that famous clap. Not that one, obviously, the clap they do. Anyway, this was Iceland's first major tournament, so on paper Portugal were expected to win. And it started off well. In the 31st minute, André Gomes played a great through ball across to Nani and finished it to make it 1-0. Portugal were ahead and everything seemed normal, but 5 minutes into the second half, Iceland equalised through Birkir Björnsson. 1-1, and that was how it ended. Portugal's first game of the tournament ended in a draw, which to be fair, looking now at the World Cup, you can see that is pretty much the most Portugal thing possible. But at the time, it felt like a really bad result. This was supposed to be the easy group, and Portugal was supposed to win it. And instead, after one game, they'd already looked frustrated. But there was no time to dwell on it because 4 days later, they faced Austria. And if the Iceland game was frustrating, the Austria game was even worse, because Portugal drew 0-0. And it wasn't just a quiet 0-0. Portugal had chances, they had the ball, they had control, and still couldn't find a way through. And Cristiano Ronaldo even had the perfect chance to win it from the penalty spot, but he hit the post. He also had a goal disallowed for offside. And by full time, Portugal had played 2 games, drawn both, and scored once. Now the pressure was really building and questions were being asked of Cristiano Ronaldo. He had come into the tournament after a long season with Real Madrid, including the Champions League final, but he didn't look completely sharp. And Portugal, the team that everyone expected to walk this group, suddenly needed a result against Hungary or they would be out. And the final group game was pure chaos. On the 22nd of June, Portugal faced Hungary in Lyon, and things started horribly. In the 19th minute, Hungary legend Zoltan Gira scored a brilliant low strike to make it 1-0, and Portugal were in trouble. But just before half time, Ronaldo slipped the ball through to Nani, and Nani finished it to make it 1-1. A lifeline. But then, after half time, Hungary went ahead again. Senyk made it 2-1 in the 47th minute, and then Portugal responded almost instantly. Cristiano Ronaldo scored one of the best goals of the tournament, flicking Jalmero's cross into the net with a ridiculous mid-air back heel. 2-2. Portugal were alive again, but of course, because this was Portugal at Euro 2016, they couldn't just make it simple. Senyk scored again, this time with a deflected effort. Hungary were 3-2 up. And once again, Portugal was staring at disaster, and once again, Cristiano Ronaldo tracked them back. In the 62nd minute, he headed Portugal's third equaliser of the night. 3-3. And that was how it ended. Portugal had played 3 group games, had drawn all 3, and they had finished third in what looked like one of the easiest groups of the tournament. And in previous Euros, that would have been it. Portugal would have gone crashing out. They'd finished third in the group, but Euro 2016 was different. Because the tournament had expanded to 24 teams, 4 of the 6 third place teams went through to the round of 16. And that's how Portugal scraped in. Not as group winners storming the group, not even as runners up, but one of the third best placed teams. The other third best teams, Slovakia, Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland and Portugal. Turkey and Albania missed out, so Portugal survived. But barely. 3 games, 3 draws, third place, and somehow still alive. But it was not convincing, and it was not pretty, and it definitely did not look like the start of a team who were about to become European champions. But of course, that's what makes this story so strange, because Portugal's tournament should have probably ended in the group stage. But instead, it was only the beginning. But now going into the round of 16, there were no easy games left. Portugal had scraped through the group stages, 3 games, 3 draws, third place. And the reward was Croatia. And this was not any Croatia side, this was Croatia with Luka Modric in his prime, Mario Mandzukic, Ivan Rakitic, Brozovic, Perisic, Subasic and their captain, Senyk. And you could argue this was actually the beginning of Croatia's golden generation. A group of players who 2 years later would go all the way to the World Cup final. So for Portugal, this was a massive test. And the game itself was intense. Very tense in fact. It was not a classic. In fact, for large parts of it, it was the exact opposite. Both teams were very cautious, both teams were very well disciplined, and both teams knew that one mistake could end their entire tournament. And Croatia had a lot of technical quality, Portugal stayed compact. And to be honest, Portugal didn't create much either, but they stayed alive for most of the game. And that really was becoming the theme of their tournament. They had to stay alive, they suffered and they waited, and then when that moment comes, they snatched it, that one individual moment of quality. And in the 170th minute, that moment finally came. Croatia pushed forward and Portugal broke on the counter. Renato Sanchez carried the ball through midfield confidently as he does, moved it on and suddenly Portugal had space. Cristiano Ronaldo found the ball at his feet, who shot, and the shot was saved by Subasic. But waiting at the back post for the rebound was Ricardo Quaresma. And Quaresma, one of the most unpredictable but important players in Portuguese football history, headed it home into an empty net. And it was 1-0 Portugal. In the 170th minute, it was ugly, it was late, it was arguably cruel on Croatia, but that was tournament football, and that was Fernando Santos' ball. And Portugal were through. Next up, in the quarterfinals, it was Poland. And again, this was not an easy game. Poland had their own serious generation of players. Robert Lewandowski was the obvious danger, one of the best strikers in the world, but around him they had Milic, Błaszczykowski, Piszczek, Kamil Glik, Krychowiak and Lukas Fabianski. This was a good team, and Portugal's quarterfinals started in the worst possible way. After just 2 minutes, Poland scored. Grosicki got down the left hand side, crossed it in, and Lewandowski finished. And it was 1-0 to Poland. Portugal behind almost immediately. And suddenly, after barely surviving the group and scraping past Croatia, they were staring at another problem. But this Portugal team did not panic. And in the 33rd minute, they found their answer from the 18-year-old. Renato Sanchez played a 1-2 with Nani, got the ball onto his left foot, and smashed a shot, deflected to be fair, past Fabianski, and it was 1-1. And for Renato this was huge. He was 18 years old at his first major tournament, starting in the European Championship quarter-final. And he just scored one of Portugal's biggest goals of that tournament. But after that goal, the game tightened up and neither side could find a winner. 90 minutes passed, then extra time passed, and Portugal were going into penalties. And this is where things got nervy. Because as mentioned before, in Euro 2012 they lost a semi-final shootout to Spain. And one of the players who missed that night was João Moutinho. Cristiano Ronaldo was supposed to take Portugal's 5th penalty that night, but he never even got the chance. So this time, things were different. Ronaldo would call João Moutinho over and insist that he would take a penalty.
Anda bater, anda, tu bates bem, perdemos que se foda, anda, solidariedade, vai, solidariedade, tu bates bem, confiança caralho, volta aqui no vai caralho, vamos lá caralho.
And this time, it did go differently. Ronaldo stepped up and scored. Lewandowski stepped up and scored. Then Renato Sanchez. Then it was Milic. Then came João Moutinho. 4 years earlier, he had missed against Spain. And this time, he had to score. He had to face his ghost of Euro 2012. And he did exactly that. He scored. And then came Jakub Błaszczykowski. One of Poland's most experienced players. One of their leaders. But it was Rui Patricio who saved it. And suddenly, Portugal had the advantage. It was Ricardo Quaresma, the man who saved Portugal against Croatia, now had the chance to send them into the semi-finals. He stepped up and he scored. And Portugal were through. Again, it was an ugly win. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't dominant, but it was a survival win. And waiting for them in the semi-finals were Wales. And you might be thinking, Wales? Like, that's not a tough game. But Wales had been one of the surprise stories of this entire tournament. This was their first Euros and they'd been nothing short of brilliant. They had Gareth Bale, who at the time was definitely one of the best players in the world and was playing some of the best football of his entire career. They had Aaron Ramsey, who was a leader in the middle. They had players like Joe Allen, Ashley Williams, Neil Taylor, and Hal Robson-Kanu, who all had fantastic tournaments. Robson-Kanu somehow turned into Johan Cruyff for one night against Belgium. And their route hadn't been easy either. They beat Slovakia, they lost late to England, they battered Russia to top their group. And they weren't supposed to top that group anyway. In the round of 16, they beat Northern Ireland. And then in the quarterfinals, they produced one of the shocks of the tournament by beating a Belgium golden generation 3-1. So yes, Wales were definitely the underdogs, but they were dangerous underdogs. They were organised and they were full of confidence and they had absolutely nothing to lose. But they did have one major problem. Aaron Ramsey was suspended. Okay, two major problems because Ben Davies was also suspended too. And it was against a Portugal side who'd been surviving on small margins all tournament. And those absences did prove to matter. For the first half the game was tight. Wales worked hard and Portugal stayed patient. And then early in the second half, Portugal found the breakthrough. Rafael Guerreiro crossed the ball in, Cristiano Ronaldo rose above everyone, and his header was absolutely ridiculous. 1-0 to Portugal. A proper Cristiano Ronaldo moment. This time, Portugal struck again. Ronaldo hit a shot from distance, Nani reacted the quickest and guided it into the net. And that was 2-0, and for once Portugal didn't need extra time, they didn't need penalties, they didn't need a last minute winner, they beat Wales in 90 minutes. And Portugal were in the final of Euro 2016. But this is where the story gets even bigger, because waiting for them in Paris were not just one of the favourites, but the hosts, France. A France team with quality everywhere. A France team playing in their own country. A France team that had beaten Germany on the way in the semi-finals. And a France team to almost everyone watching were definitely the favourites to win it all. Portugal barely survived Croatia, they barely survived Poland. They did beat Wales convincingly, But then they had to face their biggest test of all. And to say this France team was stacked would be an understatement. They had an absolutely ridiculous squad. They had Paul Pogba in his prime, Antoine Griezmann was having the tournament of his life, Olivier Giroud a proper number 9 and France's record goal scorer. They had Dimitri Payet, who had been one of the stars of the tournament. They had Blaise Matuidi, Patrice Evra, Samuel Umtiti, Koscielny, Sagna and Hugo Lloris. Even players off the bench, they had Kingsley Coman, Anthony Martial, Henri-Pierre Gignac, N'Golo Kante, Johan Cabaye and Luca Digne. This was a host nation that had quality in every single position. And unlike Portugal, France's road to the final had been much smoother. They opened the tournament against Romania, and although they were made to work for it, Dimitri Payet scored a brilliant late winner to give France a 2-1 victory. They beat Albania 2-0, then they drew 0-0 with Switzerland, which was enough for them to finish top of the group. In the round of 16, they faced the Republic of Ireland, and actually that game started horribly for France. Ireland scored a penalty in the second minute for Robbie Brady, and for a while it looked like there could be a huge upset. But then Antoine Griezmann, as he did in this tournament, took over. 2 goals in the second half, France won 2-1 and Ireland had Shane Duffy sent off. And to be fair, that time, France were doing the surviving. Then came Iceland in the quarterfinals, and Iceland, as mentioned before, had been one of the stories of the tournament. They not only had shocked Portugal, but they shocked England in the round of 16, and they had brought the thunderclap to the world. And they looked like a team of destiny, but against France, they finally met their match. France won convincingly, 5-2, and it was still an amazing tournament for Iceland, and no one was going to forget what they'd done, but France were just too strong. Then came the semi-final. France against Germany, the hosts against the world champions, and Germany was still very good, of course fresh, winning off that 2014 World Cup. Manuel Neuer, Kimmich, Boateng, Ozil, Toni Kroos, Thomas Müller and Bastian Schweinsteiger, a squad full of experience, quality and tournament pedigree. But yet again, the man of the moment was Antoine Griezmann. He scored twice, France won 2-0 and suddenly they were in the final at home with their best player on fire. Griezmann had 6 goals at Euro 2016 and ended up with the Golden Boot. He was the player everyone was talking about. And now the final was set, because it was the hosts with the favourites against the survivors and arguably quite underwhelming Portugal team. It was a star-studded final. But very quickly, it became a final with one less star. Early in the game, Cristiano Ronaldo was caught by Dimitri Payet. Whether you think it was clumsy, unlucky, or something more, the result was still the same. Ronaldo was hurt, and at first he tried to carry on, he went back down. He came back on again. He tried again, but he just couldn't move properly. He couldn't run, and in the 25th minute, Portugal's captain, Portugal's best ever player, and arguably the best player in the world at that time, depending on who you ask, had to come off injured. He was replaced by Ricardo Quaresma. And for a neutral, this game probably wasn't the most exciting final, but for Portugal fans, and I imagine France fans, it was torture, because this was a nightmare scenario for Portugal. Portugal had spent years chasing a major trophy. Ronaldo spent his entire international career trying to win something for his country, and in the biggest game of his life for Portugal, he was gone after 25 minutes. So now Portugal had to rely on something else, or someone else, or in this case, everyone else. And France had been the better team for long periods. They had chances. Griezmann forced Rui Patricio into saves, one of which made a statue in Rui Patricio's hometown just because of how good it was. Gignac hit the post in stoppage time, and Portugal, at times, were just barely hanging on. But they were hanging on. Rui Patricio was excellent and had been in the knockout rounds, only conceding that 1 goal to Poland. Pepe was immense. Jose Font was his solid centre-back partner. William Carvalho protected the defence. Rafael Guerreiro kept going against the nation he was born in and the nation really of his heritage. Cedric worked, João Mario worked, Nani worked, everyone worked. But also everyone suffered, everyone defended. And then Fernando Santos made the change that would define an entire tournament, an entire legacy, and an entire nation. In the 79th minute, Eder came on for Renato Sanchez. And honestly, across Portugal, there are a lot of sides. I know it definitely was from my household because Eder had barely featured at that tournament. He was not the glamorous option. He was known as the quote ugly duckling. He was the player people were not expecting to become a national hero. And Eder's career really can't just be summed up here. I made a full video on Eder and genuinely it is such a crazy story. He overcame tragedy, struggle, mental health issues, being one of the first Portuguese players that at least I remember to actually vividly talk about mental health in still an era where that really wasn't well known for footballers. But he went through all that to become a hero for Portugal. So make sure, please, you check that out. It's a really good video, I think. And the story is good as well. But in this moment, when Eder came on, the feeling was probably not excitement. It was more, really? Eder? But 90 minutes came and went. Portugal were still alive. They could take this into penalties. And the way they performed on penalties against Poland gave Portugal fans hope that maybe they could take it all the way. By now, Ronaldo was back on the touchline, limping around, shouting instructions, basically turning into Fernando Santos' assistant manager. Portugal were exhausted and France were frustrated. And then in the 109th minute, it happened. Eder picked up the ball outside the box. He held off Laurent Koscielny. He created a yard of space. And as he shaped a shoot, you could almost imagine every Portuguese fan in the world shouting the same thing. Oh no, Eder is shooting. But then he hit it low, hard, and the ball just kept travelling and travelling and travelling before it passed Hugo Lloris and found the bottom corner. Portugal won, France nil. Eder, of all people, not Cristiano Ronaldo, not Nani, not Quaresma, not João Moutinho. Eder had scored the biggest goal in Portuguese football history. But still, Portugal had to survive again. France threw everything forward. Anthony Martial came on, and Portugal had to defend every single ball, cross every second. Pepe defended like a monster. Jose Fonte threw himself into everything like a lower league centre-back would. But still at the highest level, Rui Patricio stayed calm in goal. William Carvalho still protected the midfield and the defence, and Cedric and Guerreiro kept their shape. João Mario, Nani, Quaresma, Moutinho, every single one of them did their job. And on the touchline, Ronaldo kept shouting, kept pointing, kept living every second vicariously through the 11 players on the pitch. And then, finally, the final whistle went. Portugal had done it. Portugal had beaten France. In France, without their best player at the time and in their history, with Eder scoring the winner 1-0 after extra time. Portugal were European champions. And honestly, it was a heist. A beautiful but horrible, stressful, perfect Portuguese heist in Paris. But that is what makes Euro 2016 so special. Because Portugal did not win this tournament the way people expected a European champion to win it. They didn't dominate every game, they didn't blow teams away, they didn't play the prettiest football. In fact, for large parts of this tournament, they were frustrating, tense defenses and sometimes genuinely painful to watch. 3 draws in the group stage, a last minute winner against Croatia, penalties against Poland, a semi-final against Wales, and then in the final losing Cristiano Ronaldo after 25 minutes. This was not supposed to be Portugal's story. Portugal had better teams before. The 2004 team was better on paper. The 2006 team was arguably stronger. Even the teams maybe in 2008 and 2010 and 2012 probably had more obvious talent in certain areas, but none of them did what this Portugal team did. Because this Portugal team had something different. They had a team that could suffer, that sacrificed, that had experience, late bloomers, young players with no fear, veterans who refused to go away, Rui Patricio making huge saves, Pepe playing like a monster, Jose Font, despite making his international debut at 30, was playing like he was in his prime because he was in his prime. William Carvalho at that age, still quite a young midfielder, was still protecting everything in front of him. João Moutinho overcame the penalty demons of Euro 2012. Renato Sanchez announced himself to the world, and I know his career didn't go as spectacularly as some might have hoped, but still he will have this moment and this tournament to hang his hat on. Nani stepped up and scored when Portugal needed them. Quaresma delivered in 2 massive moments, and Ronaldo, even injured, turned into a coach on the touchline but still scored and carried Portugal through some of it. And then there's Eder, the man that no one expected to become a hero. The man who had came on and Portugal fans probably feared the worst. The man who hit the shot that changed Portuguese football forever, and that is why, for Portugal fans, this tournament will never be forgotten. Because Euro 2016 was not just Portugal winning a trophy, it was Portugal finally getting over the line. After the heartbreak of Euro 2004, losing in their home tournament to Greece, and then the near miss of the World Cup in 2006, after years of being close but not close enough, Portugal finally had their moment. And they did it in the most Portuguese way possible. By suffering, surviving, to be honest, making everyone very nervous, and somehow by winning. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't perfect, but it was Portugal. Portugal went into France as outsiders. They left European champions. And 10 years later, it still feels unbelievable. I don't know how this tournament is going to go for Portugal. It really could go either way. We could have someone like, I don't know, Gonzalo Guedes being the Eder of that tournament. Or maybe Ronaldo still rolls back the years and brings a trophy again home to Portugal, one that you've never won in the World Cup. But let me know in the comments, where does Euro 2016 rank in Portugal's greatest football moments, or even just football moments and tournaments for you as a fan, if you're Portuguese or you're not? It was definitely the best moment in Portuguese football history. I'm recording this video on the 26th of June, so it could be another tournament that's good, but who knows? And outside of Ronaldo, Eder, Font, Moutinho, Pepe, Ricardo Carvalho, Fernando Santos, Nani, Quaresma, does anyone else deserve credit for that tournament that I haven't mentioned? But of course, if you did enjoy this video, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Please check out my video on Eder's incredible story, because trust me, that goal becomes even more powerful when you understand the journey behind the man who scored it. And also, I'm so sorry for sweating. It's the UK heat wave. It's like 34 degrees outside. I'm sweating, as you can probably tell. I've looked like I've just played in that Euro 2016 final. Look at the sweat on me. Jeez Louise. But anyway, thank you very much. I've been Senyk. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time, and peace.